Nothing in existence moves in a straight line forever. This is not a poetic observation. It is a law. Everything that appears stable is already in motion, and everything that seems to advance is already preparing its return. Civilizations rise and fall. Breath expands and contracts. Thought itself moves in waves, attention followed by fatigue, desire followed by withdrawal, effort followed by emptiness. Most human suffering begins with the refusal to accept this movement. The principle of rhythm does not ask for belief. It operates regardless of awareness. It governs the tides of the ocean and the tides of the mind with equal precision. Where it is understood, life flows with less friction. Where it is resisted, strain appears and is misinterpreted as personal failure. This is why exhaustion is so common, yet so poorly understood. Modern consciousness is trained to push forward continuously. Growth is imagined as linear. Progress is expected to accumulate without interruption. Rest is treated as a pause between efforts rather than an essential phase of the same movement. In doing so, the natural swing of rhythm is denied, and the individual attempts to remain permanently on one side of the pendulum. This attempt always fails. When effort is extended beyond its lawful phase, it does not produce more power. It produces backlash, fatigue, discouragement, emotional dullness, and loss of clarity are not random symptoms. They are the counterswing asserting itself. Rhythm cannot be escaped. It can only be understood and worked with. The Hermetic teachings were precise about this. They did not present rhythm as a moral lesson, nor as a psychological tendency, but as a universal oscillation. Everything moves between poles. Activity gives way to rest. Expression gives way to silence. Expansion gives way to contraction. This movement is not punishment or reward. It is balance maintaining itself. Where ignorance prevails, the swing feels violent. Where understanding exists, the swing becomes gentle. The pendulum is not the enemy. Resistance to it is. The initiate learns early that power is not generated by constant motion, but by timing. To act at the wrong phase of rhythm is to struggle against the current. To rest at the wrong phase is to stagnate. Mastery begins not with control, but with observation, recognizing where one stands within the swing. This recognition is rare. Most people confuse rest with weakness because they have been trained to equate motion with worth. They assume that if they are not striving, they are falling behind. But this assumption ignores a fundamental Hermetic truth. The receptive phase is not passive. It is preparatory. It is the invisible accumulation that makes the next movement possible. In nature, nothing receives without purpose. The soil rests before it nourishes. Night falls before growth accelerates. Even the heart rests between beats. Remove the pause, and the system collapses. Yet the human mind attempts precisely this to eliminate the inward phase while demanding perpetual outward force. The result is imbalance. When the principle of rhythm is ignored at the mental level, the mind loses its ability to receive. Insight dries up. Creativity becomes forced. Strength becomes brittle. The individual continues to act, but no longer renews. Effort becomes increasingly expensive. This is not because the individual lacks discipline, it is because they lack alignment. Hermetic wisdom never glorified strain. It emphasized poise, the ability to remain centered while movement occurs. The pendulum swings, but the adept does not identify with its extremes. They learn to stand inwardly still while outward motion continues. This stillness is not inactivity, it is neutrality. Neutrality allows one to experience both phases of rhythm without being carried away by either. When activity rises, action is taken fully. When withdrawal arrives, rest is allowed without guilt. In this way, rhythm becomes a source of power rather than a cause of suffering. Most people do the opposite. They cling to activity and resist rest. Then, when rest is forced upon them through exhaustion or crisis, they resent it. This resentment amplifies the swing. What could have been a gentle withdrawal becomes collapse. What could have been renewal becomes stagnation. The law was never cruel. It was simply ignored. To understand rhythm is to recognize that receiving is as lawful as giving. Silence is as necessary as speech. Inward attention is as potent as outward action. Nothing is lost in the inward phase unless it is resisted. Resistance creates friction. Friction creates fatigue. Fatigue is mistaken for failure. The Hermetic path reverses this misunderstanding. It teaches that true mastery does not lie in outrunning the pendulum, but in neutralizing its extremes within consciousness. One still participates in motion, but without identification. One acts without clinging to action. One rests without collapsing into inertia. This is the hidden meaning behind rest as power. Rest is not escape. It is receiving strength, receiving clarity, receiving direction. But receiving cannot occur when the mind remains tense. A clenched hand cannot accept what is offered. Only openness allows inflow. This is why so many seek strength and find only exhaustion. They attempt to take from life instead of allowing life to move through them. They remain mentally contracted even during rest. Their bodies stop, but their consciousness continues to push. Rhythm is violated internally even when it is obeyed externally. The initiate learns to rest inwardly first. This inward yielding does not mean abandoning purpose. It means releasing resistance to the phase that is present. When activity wanes, they do not panic. When silence arrives, they do not fill it compulsively. They understand that what is gathered in stillness determines the quality of the next expression. Here lies the first key of the veiled temple. Power does not come from continuous exertion. It comes from lawful alternation. Those who know how to rest know how to receive. Those who know how to receive are never truly depleted. The pendulum will continue to swing. The question is not whether rhythm will act, but whether consciousness will move with it or be dragged by it. When rhythm is misunderstood, exhaustion is explained psychologically. When rhythm is ignored, exhaustion is blamed personally. When rhythm is known, exhaustion is recognized as a signal of misalignment, not a flaw. The ancient mind did not ask why people became tired. It asked where they were standing within the cycle. Every manifestation of power follows a curve. It rises, crests, and recedes. To demand that power remain permanently at its peak is to demand the suspension of law. The human being does this unconsciously, especially at the mental level, where effort is expected to be continuous and interruption is treated as failure. This expectation produces strain long before the body collapses. The mind attempts to remain permanently expressive, thinking, deciding, striving, correcting, anticipating. It does not recognize its own inward phase. It resists silence. It mistrusts stillness. It fills every pause with activity, fearing that nothing will happen if nothing is done. This fear is the root of exhaustion. According to Hermetic understanding, strength is not depleted by use alone. It is depleted by use without alternation. The pendulum must return. When it is denied its inward swing, it rebounds with force. What appears as burnout is not loss of power, but power reclaiming balance. The error lies in interpreting this return as weakness. Modern consciousness treats withdrawal as decline. Rest is labeled regression. Stillness is mistaken for stagnation. Yet, in every natural system, withdrawal is the phase in which renewal occurs. Seeds germinate underground. Night restores what day consumes. Silence precedes understanding. The human mind, however, resists this law more than any other system. It attempts to live entirely on the outward arc of the swing. It demands constant clarity, constant motivation, constant strength. When these fail to appear, the mind increases pressure, believing that greater effort will override the downward movement. This response accelerates depletion. Hermetic teaching does not condemn effort, it corrects timing. Effort applied at the receptive phase creates tension. Effort applied at the expressive phase creates results. To confuse these phases is to waste energy. This confusion is widespread because rhythm is least visible at the mental level. Physical fatigue is obvious. Emotional withdrawal can be felt. But mental overextension often disguises itself as responsibility, ambition, or discipline. The individual continues functioning while silently losing coherence. Eventually, clarity dulls. Decisions become heavy. Thought repeats itself. This is not intellectual failure. It is the mind entering its inward phase while being forced outward. The body may obey the need for rest, but consciousness often does not. True rest is not the absence of movement, it is the absence of resistance. A person can lie still while mentally pushing. They can sleep while inwardly braced. In such states, rhythm is not honored, it is merely postponed. The pendulum waits, then swings harder. This is why recovery often feels incomplete. Rest taken without inward yielding does not restore power. It delays collapse, but does not replenish clarity. The initiate understands that rest must occur first in awareness, not in circumstance. This awareness recognizes a simple truth. The receptive phase is when power is gathered, not lost, in Hermetic terms. The inward swing is when potential accumulates. It is when insight condenses. It is when strength reorganizes itself. But this can only occur if consciousness allows itself to receive rather than insist on control. Control resists rhythm. The more one attempts to dominate the cycle, the more violently it asserts itself. This is why people who pride themselves on endurance often experience sudden collapse. They have delayed the inward phase until it can no longer be gentle. The law was never absent, it was postponed. The principle of rhythm also explains why certain periods feel unproductive, even when effort continues. These periods are often misjudged. They are not barren, they are gestational. But because results are not immediately visible, the mind labels them as failure and applies pressure. Pressure at this phase interrupts formation, just as pulling a seed from the soil halts its growth. Forcing outward motion during the inward phase halts renewal. The result is effort without yield. Motion without meaning, activity without power. Those who understand rhythm do something different. They listen for the inward turn. They sense when clarity recedes and do not pursue it aggressively. They allow the mind to quiet without filling the space. They withdraw attention from unnecessary stimulation. They stop demanding answers prematurely. This withdrawal is not resignation. It is intelligence cooperating with law. In this cooperation, receiving becomes possible. Receiving does not mean waiting passively for events. It means allowing consciousness to open rather than contract. It means releasing the demand to produce and permitting strength to reassemble itself. The initiate knows that what is received inwardly determines what can later be expressed outwardly. This is why rest is a Hermetic act. It is an act of alignment with the universal swing. It acknowledges that power does not flow endlessly in one direction. It honors the law that governs all manifestation. In doing so, it prevents exhaustion before it becomes collapse. Most people rest only when forced. They wait until symptoms appear, until fatigue overwhelms discipline, until confusion replaces clarity. At that point, the inward swing is no longer gentle. It is corrective. What could have been renewal becomes repair. The Hermetic path avoids this through awareness. By recognizing rhythm early, the initiate steps aside before strain accumulates. They do not interpret withdrawal as defeat. They interpret it as timing. They allow reception to occur willingly, rather than having it imposed. This willingness changes everything. The inward phase becomes restorative instead of threatening. Silence becomes informative rather than empty. Stillness becomes fertile rather than inert. Strength is not chased, it is gathered. The mind gradually learns that nothing is lost by yielding. In fact, what is lost is resistance itself. And as resistance dissolves, something becomes evident. The pendulum still swings, but its extremes soften. Exhaustion no longer crashes in. Renewal no longer feels accidental. Consciousness remains poised near the center, while movement continues. This is not withdrawal from life. It is mastery within motion. From this understanding, a deeper question naturally arises not about effort or rest, but about how consciousness itself oscillates, and whether the inner pendulum must always carry the individual from one extreme to the other, or whether another position is possible. That question leads directly to the hidden mechanics of the pendulum within the mind itself. The pendulum does not only swing in the outer world, its more decisive movement occurs within consciousness itself. Thought rises and falls, attention sharpens and diffuses, desire intensifies and recedes. Even conviction moves in cycles, certainty followed by doubt, clarity followed by ambiguity. These shifts are so familiar that they are rarely questioned, yet they govern the quality of inner life with the same precision that tides govern the sea. Most people live inside this movement without recognizing it. They identify with whichever side of the swing they are currently experiencing. When thought is clear, they believe clarity belongs to them. When motivation fades, they believe something has gone wrong. In doing so, they mistake a lawful oscillation for a personal condition. This misidentification amplifies suffering. When consciousness swings toward intensity, the individual clings to it. They try to prolong productivity, enthusiasm, certainty. When the swing reverses, as it must, they resist it. They judge themselves. They attempt to force the mind back to its previous state. This resistance does not stop the movement. It distorts it. The Hermetic teaching does not deny the pendulum. It reveals its mechanics. Every mental state carries its opposite implicitly. Expansion prepares contraction. Focus prepares diffusion. Excitement prepares withdrawal. To demand permanence from any state is to demand exemption from law. The pendulum is not unstable. Identification with it is at the mental level. Rhythm expresses itself as polarity in motion. Each state exists only by virtue of its contrast. High energy implies the possibility of low energy. Certainty implies doubt. Engagement implies rest. These are not failures, they are paired conditions. The problem arises when the mind attempts to live permanently at one pole. In doing so, it creates tension between what is occurring and what is desired. This tension consumes attention. Attention feeds resistance. Resistance sharpens the swing. What could have been gentle becomes extreme. This explains emotional volatility. When someone rides the upward swing without awareness, they are carried upward by it. When the downward swing arrives, they fall with equal force. The greater the attachment to one extreme, the more violent the return from it. The pendulum compensates for imbalance. The initiate learns a different stance. Instead of moving with the extremes, they cultivate inner poise. Poise does not stop the swing, it changes the point of reference. Awareness is withdrawn from the outer arc of the pendulum and placed nearer to its center. At the center, movement still exists, but it is minimal. This is the Hermetic meaning of neutralization. Neutralization does not mean suppression of feeling or thought. It means refusing to identify with the extremes. The mind still experiences clarity and dullness, energy and fatigue, certainty and doubt, but awareness remains steady. This steadiness alters the experience of rhythm. The pendulum continues to move, but it no longer carries the individual with it. The highs do not intoxicate. The lows do not collapse. Energy is conserved because it is not invested in resistance or attachment. Most people mistake this state for indifference. It is not indifference, it is equilibrium. Equilibrium allows participation without possession. One acts fully during the expressive phase, yet does not cling to it. One allows withdrawal during the receptive phase, yet does not fear it. Both movements are recognized as lawful. At this point, rest takes on a different meaning. Rest is no longer collapse after overextension. It becomes conscious withdrawal of identification. Attention retreats inward, not as escape, but as recentering. This inward movement replenishes clarity because it restores alignment with rhythm rather than opposing it. The mind begins to learn something essential. It learns that silence is not absence. It learns that ambiguity is not failure. It learns that waiting is not stagnation. These realizations soften the extremes of mental movement. The swing becomes shorter. The transitions become smoother. Strength is no longer lost in the descent because descent is no longer resisted. This is how receiving becomes possible. Receiving requires openness. Openness cannot exist where fear of loss dominates. When the downward movement is no longer feared, consciousness relaxes. In that relaxation, insight, clarity, and strength are allowed to return naturally. The Hermetic masters understood this well. They taught that mastery over rhythm begins with mastery over identification. One cannot stop the tide, but one can choose where to stand. One can remain near the center while the waters rise and fall. This is why inner stillness is emphasized. Stillness is not the absence of movement. It is the absence of attachment. It allows one to experience motion without being consumed by it. In this way, the pendulum no longer dictates fate. It becomes a function rather than a force. Most people are moved by rhythm unconsciously. They interpret its effects personally. They struggle during withdrawal and overextend during ascent. Their lives oscillate between intensity and depletion. This pattern repeats until awareness intervenes. When awareness does intervene, the experience changes quietly. Energy stabilizes. Emotional swings soften. Clarity returns without being chased. Strength is conserved because it is no longer spent fighting lawful movement. This does not remove challenge. It removes unnecessary suffering. From this position of inner poise, rest is no longer something to recover from collapse. It becomes a deliberate act of alignment, and alignment, once established, naturally leads consciousness to recognize a deeper truth that the pendulum's movement can be balanced, not by stopping it, but by understanding how to yield without losing power. That recognition opens the door to a subtler form of mastery, one in which rest and action are no longer opposites, but complementary phases of the same intelligent motion. When inner poise is discovered, rest is no longer interpreted as absence of power. It is recognized as a phase of power operating inwardly. The error that persists in most minds is the belief that power exists only where motion is visible. Action is equated with effectiveness, and stillness with inactivity. From this misunderstanding arises a subtle anxiety. If one stops acting, one will fall behind. If one rests, one will lose momentum. Hermetic law contradicts this entirely. Rest is not the opposite of action. It is the complementary arc of the same movement. Every outward expression is preceded by an inward gathering. Every manifestation depends on a prior state of reception, without this receptive phase. Action becomes hollow movement without substance. This is evident everywhere in nature. Night does not oppose day, it prepares it. The seed does not resist the soil's darkness, it depends on it. The bow must be drawn back before the arrow can fly. In each case, power accumulates precisely where motion appears to stop. The mind, however, resists this logic. It has been trained to measure value through visible output. When output pauses, it assumes loss. This assumption leads to forced effort during phases meant for withdrawal. The individual continues pushing outward while the system is turning inward. The result is distortion. When rest is denied its lawful place, it does not disappear. It returns as collapse, as confusion, as loss of clarity. What could have been a conscious yielding becomes an imposed interruption. Hermetic wisdom treats rest as an act of intelligence. To rest consciously is to recognize the direction of the inner tide and cooperate with it. It is not to abandon purpose, but to preserve it. Power that is not renewed becomes brittle. Power that renews itself remains available. This is why rest, rightly understood, is not passive. In the receptive phase, consciousness absorbs, insight reorganizes, understanding settles. What was scattered begins to cohere. The absence of outward motion allows inner structure to reform. Receiving occurs here. But receiving cannot happen where tension dominates. A mind still clinging to effort cannot receive clarity. A consciousness still insisting on control cannot absorb strength. The inward phase requires a different posture, one of openness rather than assertion. This posture is unfamiliar to many. They associate openness with vulnerability, and vulnerability with risk. They fear that if they loosen their grip, nothing will support them. This fear is born of identification with effort rather than alignment with law. Yet the law operates regardless of belief. When openness is allowed, something becomes evident. Rest does not weaken strength, it reveals it. Strength that depended on tension fades, but strength that depended on alignment remains. What is lost is not power, but unnecessary strain. This distinction explains a common experience. After true rest, not mere inactivity, but inward yielding clarity often returns unexpectedly. Solutions appear without being pursued. Decisions simplify. Direction becomes obvious. These are not coincidences. They are the natural results of receiving during the inward swing of rhythm. The initiate learns to recognize this phase early. Instead of waiting for exhaustion, they sense when outward force becomes expensive. They notice when thought begins to repeat, when action feels heavy, when clarity dulls. These are not signals to push harder. They are indicators that the receptive phase has arrived. Yielding at this moment preserves power. Yielding does not mean disengagement from life. It means disengagement from unnecessary assertion. The initiate remains attentive, but not forceful. Available, but not driven. In this state, the inward tide completes its work gently rather than violently. This is the Hermetic meaning of rest as mastery. It is the ability to withdraw without fear and to return without urgency, to allow silence without filling it compulsively, to permit not knowing without anxiety. These capacities conserve strength more effectively than any technique. What gradually becomes clear is that receiving is not optional. It is a lawful phase of manifestation. Whatever refuses to receive will eventually be emptied. Whatever allows reception will be replenished. The law does not judge, it balances. From this understanding, effort itself is redefined. Effort is no longer continuous pressure. It becomes timed participation, applied when expression is natural, withdrawn when reception is required. In this way, action and rest cease to oppose each other. They form a single rhythmic intelligence. As this intelligence is honored, the individual no longer fears the inward turn. They begin to sense that what is gathered in stillness determines the quality of what will later be expressed. That the depth of reception sets the limit of power. That true strength is measured not by how long one can push, but by how fully one can receive. This realization naturally draws attention toward another misunderstanding, one even subtler than the fear of rest, the belief that yielding means surrendering power itself. Rather than conserving it, that belief, once examined, reveals why so many confuse yielding with loss, and why conscious yielding is, in fact, one of the most precise expressions of mastery over rhythm. Yielding is often misunderstood because it is confused with surrendering control. Control feels like power. Yielding feels like exposure. From this confusion arises resistance to one of the most precise operations of the Hermetic law. To yield does not mean to relinquish authority. It means to withdraw force at the correct moment. In every rhythmic system, power is conserved not by constant assertion, but by intelligent timing. A wave does not lose its strength by receding, it gathers it. The pendulum does not weaken by returning, it balances itself. Only when movement is forced against its natural direction does power dissipate. The human mind resists this principle because it equates control with safety. It believes that if effort ceases, disorder will follow. If vigilance relaxes, error will arise. This belief keeps consciousness locked in perpetual assertion, even when assertion no longer serves. Yielding is delayed until it is imposed, and what could have been conscious withdrawal becomes collapse. Hermetic teaching corrects this error by redefining power. Power is not domination over movement. Power is cooperation with movement. When yielding occurs consciously, it does not diminish strength. It preserves it. The individual does not lose direction. Direction clarifies. The will does not disappear. It becomes aligned. Action is not abandoned. It is postponed until the current supports it. This distinction separates mastery from passivity. Passive yielding is collapse under pressure. Conscious yielding is withdrawal before pressure accumulates. The initiate learns to sense the difference. When action begins to require continuous effort merely to maintain itself, yielding is indicated. When clarity must be defended rather than expressed, yielding is required. These are not signs of failure, they are signs of changing phase. Yielding at this moment prevents backlash. Backlash occurs when power is driven past its expressive arc. The mind pushes beyond clarity. The body moves beyond vitality. Emotion extends beyond coherence. Rhythm compensates by swinging forcefully in the opposite direction. What follows is experienced as loss, yet it is correction. Conscious yielding neutralizes this correction by withdrawing identification from effort at the proper time. The extreme is softened. The pendulum still moves, but it does not snap. The return becomes restorative rather than disruptive. Strength is conserved because it is not scattered through resistance. This is why yielding feels counterintuitive. It contradicts conditioning. The conditioned mind believes effort prevents decline. Hermetic law shows that misplaced effort creates decline. Yielding is not retreat from power. It is power refusing to waste itself. Receiving becomes possible only here. Receiving is not waiting. It is openness without demand. In the receptive phase, consciousness does not reach outward. It allows inward reorganization. Insight assembles itself. Direction clarifies without pursuit. What was fragmented begins to cohere. This coherence is strength in its latent form. Many miss this because latent power is invisible. It does not announce itself. It does not stimulate the senses. It operates silently, restructuring from within. Those who equate strength with sensation overlook it and attempt to replace it with force. Force blocks reception. A clenched consciousness cannot receive. Yielding opens what effort closes. This is why rest that is merely physical often fails to restore strength, because inward clenching remains. Yielding must occur at the level of identification, not posture. When identification withdraws from struggle, something subtle happens. The need to manage dissolves. The mind stops rehearsing outcomes. Attention settles. In this settling, the inward tide completes its work. What returns afterward is not excitement, but clarity, not urgency, but readiness. This readiness is the mark of true power. It does not rush to act. It responds when action is appropriate. It does not cling to stillness. It moves when movement is called for. Yielding has preserved its capacity. The Hermetic adept does not ask whether to yield. They ask when. Timing is mastery. Yield too late, and collapse follows. Yield too early, and inertia results. But when yielding is aligned with rhythm, power circulates rather than exhausts itself. From this perspective, receiving is not optional. It is the inward face of manifestation. Whatever is to be expressed must first be received in consciousness. Whatever refuses to receive will attempt to create from emptiness and call the resulting strain effort. This understanding removes moral judgment from strength. Strength is not something one deserves or earns through endurance. It is something one aligns with through intelligence. Yielding is not a concession, it is recognition of law. As this recognition deepens, another truth emerges naturally if yielding preserves power and receiving restores it. Then, mastery does not lie in escaping rhythm, but in learning how to neutralize its extremes without denying its motion. That realization leads awareness toward the subtle art of standing inwardly still while movement continues a state where the pendulum swings. Yet consciousness remains centered, uncarried, and clear. When yielding is understood as intelligence rather than retreat, attention naturally turns to a deeper question: is it possible to remain centered while rhythm continues to move? Not by resisting its motion, and not by being carried by it, but by standing inwardly still. Hermetic teaching answers this without ambiguity. The pendulum cannot be stopped, but its effects upon consciousness can be neutralized. Neutralization does not occur through suppression. It occurs through position. Every swing has a midpoint. At the extremes, movement is violent. At the center, movement exists but has minimal force. To stand at the center of rhythm is not to deny change, but to experience it without displacement. This is not a metaphor. It is a functional principle applied to consciousness. Most people live at the ends of the swing. When energy rises, they identify with expansion. They accelerate effort, amplify emotion, and mistake intensity for power. When energy falls, they identify with contraction. They withdraw, doubt, and interpret reduction as loss. Consciousness is carried back and forth, and identity shifts with the tide. This movement feels inevitable because identification is automatic. Neutralization begins when identification loosens. The initiate does not attempt to hold the upward phase, nor to avoid the downward one. Instead, awareness is relocated away from sensation and toward observation. Thought, emotion, and energy are experienced, but not inhabited. They are seen as conditions, not definitions. This relocation changes everything. When clarity rises, it is used without attachment. When clarity recedes, it is allowed without panic. The pendulum continues its arc, but consciousness remains poised. What once felt like instability becomes variation within a stable frame. This is the still point. The still point is not absence of movement. It is absence of identification with movement. From here, rhythm is perceived as a function rather than a force. It moves through experience without determining identity at this point. Effort drops naturally. Effort was never required to maintain balance, it was required to resist imbalance. Once resistance ends, balance reasserts itself. Strength is conserved not because it is protected, but because it is no longer scattered across extremes. This is why neutralization is subtle. It does not announce itself as control. It feels almost like indifference, yet it is not indifference. It is equanimity, the ability to remain present without being compelled by fluctuation. Equanimity is often mistaken for detachment. Detachment implies separation. Equanimity implies inclusion without absorption. The initiate remains fully engaged with life, but no longer stakes identity on any particular state. Action occurs, but it does not cling. Rest occurs, but it does not collapse. In this state, receiving becomes effortless, because consciousness is no longer pulled to the extremes. The inward phase of rhythm completes itself without obstruction. Insight arrives without pursuit. Strength returns without stimulation. Direction clarifies without insistence. The mind begins to trust this process. Trust here is not belief. It is recognition, formed through repetition. Each time the individual refrains from clinging to assent or resisting dissent, the system stabilizes, the pendulum's swing shortens, the extremes soften. What once felt dramatic becomes manageable. This does not remove challenge. Life continues to demand response. Decisions still carry consequence. Uncertainty still arises. What changes is the internal cost. Consciousness no longer spends energy maintaining identity against fluctuation. From this position, mastery over rhythm becomes practical. The initiate senses when to act and when to wait, not through calculation, but through alignment. Timing becomes intuitive because attention is no longer clouded by fear of loss or desire for permanence. This intuition is not mystical. It is the natural intelligence of a system no longer divided against itself. When extremes no longer dominate awareness, perception sharpens. The appropriate response reveals itself without urgency. At this level, rest and action are no longer opposites. They are phases recognized and honored without emotional charge. Yielding occurs without loss of authority. Movement occurs without strain. Strength circulates instead of accumulating and collapsing. This is the hidden advantage of neutralization. The pendulum continues to move, but its movement no longer determines fate. Consciousness remains near the center, steady enough to receive, clear enough to act. And from this steadiness, living in accord with the tide becomes possible not as strategy, but as a natural consequence of understanding law rather than resisting it. When consciousness learns to remain near the center of the swing, life begins to reveal a different pattern. Events no longer feel random. Timing becomes noticeable. Certain movements succeed effortlessly, while others resist no matter how much force is applied. This is not chance. It is rhythm responding to participation rather than opposition. Most people attempt to live by will alone. They decide what should happen and then apply pressure until circumstances comply or collapse intervenes. In doing so, they ignore a fundamental Hermetic reality: movement has seasons. To act against the season is to exhaust oneself. To act with it is to appear fortunate. What is commonly called luck is often alignment with the tide. Living in accord with rhythm does not mean waiting passively for conditions to improve. It means recognizing when movement is supported and when it is not. The initiate does not measure readiness by desire, but by resonance, a felt coherence between inner clarity and outer possibility. This coherence is subtle. It appears as ease rather than excitement, as steadiness rather than urgency. When action aligns with rhythm, effort does not disappear, but it feels proportional. Each step advances without requiring continuous reinforcement. When misaligned, effort multiplies without yield. Most people misinterpret resistance. They treat resistance as a challenge to overcome rather than information to consider. They increase force where withdrawal is indicated. They persist where yielding would preserve strength. This persistence is praised culturally. Yet it violates the very law that governs sustainable movement. Hermetic teaching reframes resistance. Resistance is not an enemy. It is a signal of phase. When resistance increases, it often indicates that the expressive arc is closing and the receptive arc is opening. To push at this moment is to create backlash. To pause is to conserve power. Pausing here is not indecision. It is intelligence responding to rhythm. The initiate senses when outward motion becomes expensive and does not confuse cost with virtue. They withdraw attention without abandoning direction. They wait without losing readiness. This waiting is active inwardly. During the receptive phase, perception sharpens, patterns become visible. What was obscured by urgency emerges naturally. Decisions made from this clarity require less correction later. Strength gathered here determines the quality of the next movement. This is why receiving is not optional. Receiving is the phase in which law completes itself. Whatever is not received inwardly will have to be compensated for outwardly through force. The initiate understands that to receive at the right time is to reduce effort later, over time. Living this way alters the experience of effort entirely. Effort becomes situational rather than habitual. It is applied where it belongs and withdrawn where it does not. The constant background strain that once defined living begins to dissolve. Life feels rhythmic rather than relentless. This rhythm extends beyond action into thought and emotion. The initiate no longer demands permanent certainty. They allow periods of not knowing without panic. They do not cling to enthusiasm nor fear its absence. Emotional waves pass without being interpreted as identity. This creates internal space. In that space, timing becomes clearer. Opportunities are recognized not because they are desired, but because they fit. The individual begins to sense when to speak and when to remain silent, when to advance and when to hold, when to invest and when to withdraw. These choices appear intuitive. They are not instinctive in the animal sense, nor analytical in the intellectual sense. They arise from alignment with rhythm at the level of awareness. The initiate does not predict the tide, they feel it. As this sensitivity develops, the illusion of constant effort dissolves. Life no longer feels like something to be conquered. It feels like something to be navigated. Movement becomes responsive rather than imposed. Strength is preserved because it is no longer wasted on resistance. This is where rest and action finally reconcile. Rest is no longer recovery from overexertion. It is preparation. Action is no longer proof of worth. It is expression. Both belong to the same movement and are honored equally. The individual who lives this way does not appear idle. They appear timely. Their actions occur when conditions support them. Their withdrawals occur before depletion sets in. They are neither hurried nor stagnant. They move with the tide without being swept away by it. This way of living does not remove difficulty. It removes unnecessary struggle. From here, the remaining work is refinement, learning how to integrate this awareness into ordinary circumstances without turning it into strategy or control. That refinement unfolds not through effort, but through continued attentiveness to the subtle signals of rhythm as it expresses itself in every domain of life. As sensitivity to rhythm deepens, a quiet danger appears, one that often goes unnoticed. Understanding the law can become another form of control. Awareness, once meant to liberate, can harden into strategy. The mind begins to calculate timing, to monitor cycles, to anticipate swings. What was meant to restore balance is subtly converted into management. This is where many lose the thread. Hermetic mastery does not come from predicting the pendulum. It comes from remaining inwardly available while it moves. The moment awareness turns into manipulation. Alignment is replaced by tension. The system tightens again, not through ignorance, but through subtle interference. True integration requires restraint. Restraint does not mean passivity. It means refusing to turn insight into leverage. The initiate does not attempt to outsmart rhythm. They respect it. They remain attentive without attempting to engineer outcomes. This attitude preserves openness, which is the essential condition for receiving. Receiving cannot be scheduled. It occurs when consciousness is not braced against uncertainty, when attention rests without demand, when silence is allowed to remain silent. In these conditions, something reorganizes itself inwardly without instruction. This reorganization is not dramatic. It often appears as simplicity. Fewer thoughts, clearer perception. A reduction in internal urgency. Life does not suddenly change. The relationship to it does. What once required preparation now feels obvious. What once demanded effort now feels appropriate. This is the mark of inner practice. Inner practice is not something done at specific times. It is a way of relating to movement itself. When clarity is present, it is used without attachment. When clarity withdraws, it is allowed without fear. In both cases, awareness remains steady. This steadiness must not be forced. Any attempt to stay centered through effort recreates the very imbalance it seeks to avoid. Centering happens naturally when resistance subsides. The task is not to maintain stillness, but to notice when it is being disturbed unnecessarily. Disturbance is usually subtle. It begins as impatience, as the urge to resolve uncertainty prematurely, as the impulse to fill silence with activity or explanation. These impulses feel reasonable. They are often praised, yet they signal the return of control where yielding is required. Recognizing this is enough. No correction is necessary. Awareness alone loosens the grip. The impulse loses authority when it is seen clearly. Attention returns to what is actually occurring, rather than what is being anticipated. Over time, this recognition becomes familiar. The individual learns to sense when inner tension is forming and does not immediately act on it. They wait not passively, but attentively. In this waiting, the inward phase completes itself. What returns afterward is not excitement, but readiness. Readiness is quiet. It does not rush toward expression. It does not need reassurance. It carries direction without urgency. Action taken from this state feels timely, not forced. Effort aligns naturally with movement rather than opposing it. This is why techniques are unnecessary here. Techniques imply control. They suggest that alignment can be produced mechanically. Hermetic wisdom points in the opposite direction. Alignment appears when interference is removed. The role of awareness is subtractive, not additive. As this subtraction continues, life simplifies. Decisions require less deliberation. Boundaries become clearer. Energy is conserved because it is not dispersed across imagined futures or resisted phases. Strength circulates, rather than accumulates and collapses. This circulation is the practical result of honoring rhythm, not by tracking it, but by trusting it, not by mastering it intellectually, but by living in a way that does not violate it. Consciousness becomes responsive rather than reactive, receptive rather than defensive. From this state, integration completes itself naturally. There is no sense of having learned something. There is only the absence of what once interfered. The mind becomes quieter, not because it is controlled, but because it no longer needs to assert itself continuously. What remains is a way of being that feels stable without rigidity. The individual participates fully in life, yet remains inwardly unburdened. Action and rest flow into each other without conflict. Strength renews itself without effort because it is no longer consumed by resistance. This is not an achievement. It is a return to lawful functioning. And when functioning is lawful, nothing needs to be forced. When interference subsides and inner practice stabilizes, something becomes quietly evident. The law has been operating all along. Nothing new has been added. Nothing essential has been learned in the conventional sense. What has changed is participation. Rhythm is no longer experienced as disruption. It is experienced as structure. Life continues to move in waves, but these waves no longer feel personal. Expansion and contraction occur without being interpreted as success or failure. Consciousness remains oriented toward function rather than evaluation. Strength is no longer measured by intensity, but by continuity. This continuity alters perception. Moments that once felt empty now feel sufficient. Periods of withdrawal no longer provoke anxiety. Silence no longer demands explanation. What was once labeled as stagnation is recognized as preparation. What was once called delay is seen as alignment unfolding. In this state, effort becomes economical. Action arises where it belongs and withdraws where it does not. The individual no longer spends energy defending momentum or resisting pause. Movement becomes selective. Stillness becomes intentional. Both are held within the same awareness. This changes the experience of time. Urgency diminishes. There is less pressure to act prematurely, less fear of missing opportunity. Timing becomes intuitive because attention is no longer scattered across imagined outcomes. The present moment carries more information than anticipation ever could. From here, strength expresses itself quietly. It appears as the ability to remain present under fluctuation, to engage without overextension, to withdraw without collapse. This strength does not impress, it sustains, it does not spike, it endures. What integrates fully is the understanding that rest and action are not separate skills. They are two faces of the same intelligence responding to different phases. To rest when action is indicated would be avoidance. To act when rest is indicated would be resistance. Mastery lies in recognizing the difference without strain. This recognition is not analytical. It is felt as coherence. When alignment is present, action feels clean. When misalignment appears, effort feels heavy. These sensations guide participation more reliably than thought. The initiate no longer seeks certainty. Certainty belongs to static systems. Living systems move. What replaces certainty is trust in responsiveness, the capacity to adjust without losing center. This trust stabilizes behavior without rigid rules. Emotion also changes its role. Feelings are experienced without being consulted for direction. They move freely without dictating action. Emotional highs do not inflate identity. Emotional lows do not collapse it. Rhythm passes through emotion without anchoring there. This creates inner space. In that space, receiving becomes continuous rather than episodic. Insight arrives without being summoned. Strength returns without recovery rituals. Direction clarifies without debate. The inward phase is no longer something one enters. It is something one recognizes. At this level, the principle of rhythm ceases to feel like a rule. It feels like the natural shape of living. Nothing is forced to remain. Nothing is forced to go. Movement is allowed to complete itself. Consciousness remains available rather than invested. This availability is the true synthesis, not control over rhythm, but freedom within it, not dominance of movement, but participation without loss. The individual no longer oscillates between effort and collapse, but moves through cycles with minimal friction. What remains is simplicity, Life does not become smaller, it becomes clearer. Strength is not accumulated, it is conserved. Rest is not escape, it is reception. Action is not proof, it is expression. In this simplicity, the veiled temple no longer feels distant. Its keys were never hidden in complexity. They were obscured by resistance. When resistance softens, law reveals itself not as doctrine, but as lived order. And within that order, the mind finally rests, not because movement has stopped, but because it no longer needs to struggle against it. When the movement of rhythm is no longer resisted, something subtle settles into place. It is not a conclusion, and it is not a realization that can be claimed. It is more accurate to say that a certain tension is no longer necessary. The pendulum continues to move. Activity rises and falls. Clarity comes and goes. Silence alternates with expression. None of this changes. What changes is the inner relationship to these movements. They are no longer taken as instructions about identity, worth, or direction. In this state, rest no longer feels like withdrawal from life. It feels like contact with its center. There is an inward resting that occurs even while action unfolds. Thought may be active, but it is not strained. The body may be engaged, but it is not braced. Attention remains available rather than contracted. This availability is not effortful. It is the absence of unnecessary holding. This is the still point within motion. Not something achieved, but something revealed when resistance dissolves. It does not belong to one phase of the swing more than another. It remains present through ascent and descent alike, because it is not identified with either. It is not displaced by either. Here, strength takes its final form. It is no longer experienced as energy to be summoned or managed. It is experienced as stability that does not depend on conditions. This stability supports action without urging it. It supports rest without collapsing into inertia. What once required vigilance now requires attention. Attention that is relaxed, not sharpened by fear. Attention that does not scan for danger or opportunity, but remains receptive to what is actually present. From this attention, response arises naturally. This is why mastery over rhythm feels quiet. There is no sense of controlling life. There is no need to anticipate its movements. Consciousness no longer positions itself against change, nor does it attempt to prolong favorable states. It remains aligned with function rather than outcome. In this alignment, receiving is constant, not as a dramatic inflow, but as uninterrupted participation, insight, strength, and clarity circulate because nothing blocks their movement. They are not accumulated. They are not depleted. They move as needed. The idea of effort softens completely here. Effort appears when required and disappears when not. There is no background strain maintaining readiness. Readiness is inherent because awareness is unburdened. Action is taken when movement calls for it, not when anxiety demands it. This does not make life passive. It makes it proportionate. Responses match situations. Engagement matches capacity. Withdrawal matches necessity. Nothing is exaggerated. Nothing is suppressed. The pendulum moves, but consciousness remains near its center. This is the final key of the veiled temple, not a secret to be remembered, but a posture to be inhabited, a way of standing within law rather than struggling against it, a recognition that strength is preserved not by constant motion, but by intelligent alternation. At this point, nothing more needs to be added. The law does not require affirmation. Rhythm does not require belief. Alignment does not require effort. What remains is simply the absence of what once interfered. And in that absence, rest and receiving are no longer practices. They are natural consequences of understanding how life already moves. There is no instruction to carry away from this. If something has settled, it will not appear as a thought. It will appear as a change in how effort feels, or how silence is tolerated, or how urgency loosens its grip. These changes are small. They do not announce themselves. The mind may attempt to frame this as knowledge, or to apply it deliberately. That impulse belongs to the outward arc of the swing. There is no need to oppose it. Simply notice it. What has been pointed to is not a method. It is an observation about how life restores itself when it is not resisted. Rhythm does not need to be managed. It needs to be honored. When it is, strength ceases to be something pursued and becomes something that remains. Rest will arrive when it arrives. Action will arise when it arises. Neither needs to be forced. Allow the movement to complete itself. Allow the inward phases to do their work. Allow the outward phases to express without strain. Nothing essential is missing. Nothing needs to be accelerated. When the pendulum is no longer fought, it ceases to feel like a threat. And when it is no longer a threat, consciousness rests naturally at the center, quiet, receptive, and sufficient.